Distinguished guests, ladies and gentlemen, I understand that I come already quite late in the morning session, that many of you must be hungry and waiting for lunch. So I'll try to be concise and not to waste your time with unnecessary information, rather go straight to the point of my objective, the objective of my presentation. Basically, after the horrible attacks we have attended last week in Paris and all the talks, international talks we have attended since then in order to coordinate the French and the international community reaction, my purpose is to inform you about the state of play in NATO. What is our present situation? How do we consider the threats? I put intentionally an S at the end of threat, and the way we intend to prepare the alliance to react to threats, whatever the demand may be. You know that by definition, NATO is supposed to address the threats against its allies, its members, looking 360 degrees. That is to say that we do not concentrate exclusively on one geopolitical area. We try to see and identify the threat wherever it appears. And in the present circumstance of our world today, which is not an easy world, you will agree with me, we have as NATO to contemplate more precisely two main sources of threat. One in the east, and everything that has happened around Georgia, Ukraine, and other frozen conflict in the area. And another one, obviously, in the south, about which you have had already extensive discussion this morning, and on which I will concentrate a little bit more in order to talk about NATO's reaction. Obviously, NATO members all look 360 degrees and all prepare themselves politically and militarily to respond to threats from the east and from the south. There is no priority, one above the other. All of them are equally important. A word on the east, because this is something that we should not forget, despite what's happening presently in the south. You know that after Russia's rather aggressive attitude towards Georgia and more particularly Crimea and Ukraine, several members of the alliance, particularly those on the eastern and northeastern flank of the allies, felt particularly nervous about what could happen if all of a sudden it came to the mind of the Russian to go a bit further. Nobody would really contemplate Putin's tanks here in the Grand Place of Brussels or elsewhere in London or Paris, obviously. But what about a citizen from a Baltic country, where you have sometimes even important Russophone communities, and where it is not even necessary to declare a military war to control the country in a couple of hours? Hybrid warfare is something we have to learn with. What would be the reaction of NATO leaders if all of a sudden the three Baltic countries would fall under somehow a form of Russian control? Would we send troops to the risk of starting a new conflict with Russia? A new conflict about which obviously we know where we start, we don't know where we go and where it ends up. In other words, are we ready to send the boys dying for the three Baltic countries? And if only some members of the alliance have doubts about that, have doubts about the reaction and the preparedness of the alliance to react, the alliance is as good as dead. An alliance will survive only at the level of its weakest members. It was thus of vital importance for NATO, first, to reassure our members that are confronted to that sort of perception, that in case there would be an attempt by the Russians to go further than simple intimidation and muscle flexing, that the reaction would come immediately and without discussion, first of all, and second, that we have at our disposal a deterrence line that is robust enough in order to let Moscow understand that an adventurous policy would cost them more than anything else. That was precisely the objective our leaders, our political leaders, decide at the summit of Wales in September 2014. Reassurances of those allies that are nervous about the threat, adaptation of our deterrence in order to have a real effective deterrence. I'm not going to go into the details of that, what means practically, but this is the line we took. At the same time, and though this is not always easy to manage within the consensus of the alliance, we have to keep engaging Moscow from a political and diplomatic point of view. This is the good old Armel doctrine dating from the 60s and early 70s that come back forcefully to NATO. If NATO limits itself to a military attitude, even towards the East, it will be only partially efficient. There is no reason for NATO to marginalize itself, diplomatically speaking. We are, after all, a political military alliance, not exclusively a military alliance. Everybody talks to the Russian today, and certainly since Mr. Putin mastermindedly, I would say, arrange his return on the global scene as an actor that is indispensable, which he is, by the way, and in many respects. But we are facing there this strange situation on the East that we have to be strict vis-à-vis the Russians on the deterrence and also understand what their purposes are, talk to them to a certain limit. It is obvious that everything that Moscow wants cannot be accepted by us. Because this is probably, in my view, the most serious threat posed by Moscow and the Russians in general. It's not the risk of a military invasion of the territory. It's much more subtle than that. It is on the long term an objective that the Russians have pursued in the time of the Soviet Union and in the time of the post-Soviet Union. That is to say, to have a political control of the security of Europe with a veto power. That is a long-term objective for the Russian. And this is precisely, with all the consequences that one can imagine, particularly about the transatlantic relationship, this is precisely what we should avoid in long term. By having a dialogue with the Russians today that clearly set what we can accept and what we cannot accept. But having said that, I understand that today the agenda is more on the south, understandably so. And there too, there is a direct threat against NATO members and against European Union members. This threat, we have seen just one image of it. It's not the first time it has happened, and I'm afraid it's not the last time it will happen. Since the end of the Cold War, NATO understood that the concept of defense had to give way to the broader concept of security. Defense is attached to a territorial defense against any attack. Security is much broader. It encompasses the security of your citizens, of your economic interest, and is certainly not limited to your territory. This concept of security goes hand in hand with another newly developed idea after the end of the Cold War by NATO, the concept of partnership. It is obvious that NATO is not a police cop. NATO doesn't have the ambition to run the world from a security point of view. Whenever NATO acts, it does it in close cooperation with local actors. It would be completely nonsense and counterproductive to think of either military or political stabilization operation without a very strong cooperation with local actors. And by local actors, obviously, you understand, I mean regional organizations, but also local governments. That is an absolute must before NATO takes any commitment outside its territory. We have also, because of two operations NATO conducted, Afghanistan, ISAF, and Libya, we have also drawn a series of conclusions. And the first one is one that I alluded already earlier in my presentation, namely that there is no threat anymore that can be strictly and exclusively dealt with by the military force. Do not misunderstand me, the military action is indispensable. I'm afraid we have very few dictators around the world who would accept to leave their power simply because of a speech in New York. Force is needed. But force is not enough, and by far not enough, if it is not complemented by a political track with objective to bring about political stability. Let us look at what happened in Libya. NATO was given the mandate by the United Nations Security Council to strike against Gaddafi and his troops in order to protect civilians in Libya from the action of their dictator. The moment the dictator was down, NATO was kindly invited to leave Libya as soon as possible, that is to say within the 24 hours. No question for NATO to remain there. What was the result of it? Indeed, Gaddafi was gone, but what became of Libya after that? A monumental chaos, spreading threat all over the region to neighboring countries. It is, I believe, probably the best recent example to show that military action alone is not enough. It has to go hand in hand with a political track to stabilize. And this political track is obviously not up to NATO to decide what it will be. The most legitimate instance is the United Nations Security Council. Of course, I understand it's not always obvious because of the position of Russia, because of the position of China, to obtain a Security Council resolution. Nonetheless, this is the objective of all NATO allies systematically. First, we have to try by all means to obtain a resolution by New York. If only it's not possible, then we have to try to find other ways with partners in the region, among others, and with particular requests from the region. Having said that, the cooperation with the United Nations will obviously not be the only one. There is another organization in this town, the European Union, which is almost a designated partner for NATO if we want to bring about stability and contribute to peace and stability. Furthermore, the EU has a much wider panel of competences for the restoration of good governance, reconstruction of state, economic, financial matters that NATO doesn't have. NATO is specialized in military and security issues, and that's probably, without self-flattery, a sector where NATO is one of the most proficient, if not the most proficient in the world. But this is limited compared to the vast request that is needed whenever we have to talk about bringing about peace and stability. So the EU and the cooperation between EU and NATO is no longer just an option. It is an absolute necessity. And by the way, this is also very true when we talk about the hybrid type of warfare. I talked earlier about regional organizations, countries of the region. You know that NATO has developed, since many years already now, two kinds of partnership initiatives towards the south, the Mediterranean Dialogue and the ICI, Istanbul Initiative, which directly addresses countries in the Gulf area. I believe that we have to exploit much better than what we do now the partnership we have with these countries. These partnerships are rather rich, actually. They are composed of political dialogue. They are composed of training, military training in order to attain interoperability and the like. But we have to go much further. Have we really addressed what these countries are waiting for, particularly in terms of fight against terrorism, monitoring of borders, fight against the traffic of weapons all over a region? This is probably, these are expectations from the countries of the region that we are not able to provide now. So NATO has to adjust itself, like we did it on the eastern border, in order to have a better convincing deterrence line. We have to address our own capability to react against what is the actual threat in terrorism. Let us not here misunderstand myself again. I do not say that by addressing terrorism, you solve the solution. Terrorism is an epiphenomenon that appears wherever there are unresolved tensions. And like in the old Greek mythology, if you cut the head of the snake, you will have 7 different heads that will appear at the same time. That is a little bit the fight against terrorism, if you do not, at the same time, address the root causes. Some of these root causes in the Middle East can be stabilized by NATO. Some cannot, simply. NATO has no intention whatsoever to interfere in the dialogue among Muslims. This is one of the reasons why we have also tensions in the region. Muslims have to come to terms with themselves about what will be the future of their religion. How will it be organized? You have indeed 99% of the Muslims who are particularly kind people, absolutely wishing to live peacefully in Europe, in the US, or in the Middle East, or elsewhere in the world. But you have that very small percentage that have decided otherwise. That is not something where NATO can do a lot. This is basically a matter for Muslims themselves to decide among themselves. But there are other aspects. For instance, an element that we rarely mention, but that is critical for the Middle East, the economic and social situation. May I remind you that the Arab Spring started in Tunisia with a young man who killed himself because he was unable to get a proper job, whereas he had necessary education for that. This is one of the tragedies of the Middle East, that the population is very young, below 25% for such a large percentage of the population, with a good education, but no prospect of any decent job. And when you take that into account, you understand why, at the end, tensions can mount up to a level that will one day possibly degenerate in terrorism. There are other sources. It was mentioned earlier, the unresolved conflict between Israel and Palestine, I do not say that this is at the source of Daesh, certainly not. But it is a perpetual pain that remains there in the region and that gives the impression perpetually to Muslims that we have a double standard. That is also one thing, and this is not for NATO. You have a lot, I mean, the conflict between the Persian Gulf, more particularly Saudi Arabia and Iran, which is not only a religious conflict, there is a large deal of religious. There is also another conflict, which is geopolitical there. One more source. So you understand that the complexity of the situation in the Middle East is such that it would be foolish imagining NATO acting there alone. Completely foolish and counterproductive. We have to do things. We have to better adjust ourselves to do these things in the military and the security sector. But we have also to be modest enough to realize that we are just a toolbox for the international community there. A toolbox that will be prepared to be implemented whenever it's necessary on a particular theater. And not just a major actor that would decide of everything. Voilà, this is, ladies and gentlemen, a rather pragmatic and modest attitude from the part of the Atlantic Alliance, realizing very well that what we are confronting for the time being is a very serious threat. That this is a threat that we are not going to defeat in just 1 year. We have to be prepared for a long-term, a very long-term combat. But we have, all of us, to understand that without putting together the forces of those who think in the same direction, and you do not find them only in Europe or in the US, you find them likewise in the Middle East and in other parts of the world. Without putting together these forces, we will reach nothing. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Ambassador, for this broad overview and very timing, by the way. And Ambassador De Kerchove is kind enough to take some questions from the floor, if there are some. And so if somebody wants to raise a question, please. I would like to keep the Italian delegation after President Val, please.
Excellence.
Excellence.
You said that NATO was fearing not a military invasion, but it was fearing the control of Europe. Could you explain this, please? Mr. President, I'm happy that you are asking this question, which is difficult. The answer must be complete and in nuances. I will not speak about all the details of security of the NATO. I would like more to define what we are seeing today as threatenings. We saw a few months ago, which was a tragedy that still is there today, the phenomenon of massive migration. In itself, it's an element that's rather perturbating. I don't want to say that we did not accept that we do not have to accept migrants in Europe. No, we have to accept them, but we have to make sure that our world of tomorrow will be multicultural. But for a government, it is really a problem to have to control a form of migration that is not controlled. Second aspect is terrorism, and as we see here, is double. It finds its roots in the Middle East as well as within some among youngsters, mostly of Arabic origin, of Islamic origin here in Europe. We are since a long time trying to follow the foreign fighters and try to make sure that not too many of these youngsters go to the Middle East and be used to using weapons and create a real problem when they come back with intentions that are threatening their country of origin. I do think that the Romans well understood the concept of the Mediterranean. They called it Mare Nostrum, our sea. It belongs to those who live in the north, but also those who live in the south. If you have unstable places now that develop in the south of the Mediterranean, automatically the security of the North Mediterranean will also be threatened, be it by terrorism, by other phenomena. For example, Daesh, it's a non-government, an NGO that's rather rich and that has missiles that they might send to the south of the Mediterranean, Scud missiles, for example, because they've got them. For the moment, we have the problem with the whole stability of the south of the Mediterranean, and the north of the Mediterranean has to be concerned about this instability, because if we don't do it, it very quickly will cause us a problem.
Okay, a very quick question, please.
Thank you very much. The question is following. You said that defense is really attached to the territory, security is wider. Now, in your view, that NATO is a structure that is dealing with the defense internally. What kind of a step should take on the wider security matter with the political component of this? On the neighborhood and active partnership, or it should go even wider to the world?
NATO, in my speech, was not only described as an organization to secure collective defense. I told you that from the end of the Cold War onwards, NATO started to understand that the concept of defense was not enough. It had to be replaced by the concept of security, and that very concept of security has to be dealt with in a much wider way, and sometimes even far away from the territory of the alliance. I have given also you two examples of operations that were conducted by NATO, one in Afghanistan, actually conducted on the name of the Security Council, that has put NATO at the head of ISAF mission in Afghanistan during more than 13 years. And on the other hand, the operation that we conducted in Libya. So these are two examples of operations of, I would say, cooperative security that were conducted by NATO. What were the actors at that time involved in these operations? Well, in these two cases, we had a mandate of the Security Council. So obviously, the United Nations was there to give a legitimacy to the action of NATO. On the case of Afghanistan, you may remember that this was, first of all, by far more than just NATO. ISAF used to be a mission that contains, help me Bob, something like 51 countries, all in all, but certainly not limited to the 28 NATO member states. So it was a very wide segment of the international community that was acting there, including countries of the region, obviously. Thirdly, in Afghanistan, you had several other international organizations that were present in order to contribute to the restoration of the country and to its reconstruction. You had UN agencies that were present. You had even non-governmental organizations like RCRC and other humanitarian organizations that are still present today on the field of Afghanistan. So it was a very wide operation encompassing a lot of different actors. The case of Libya was different, and I'm afraid, as I told you, that in the case of Libya, NATO was not allowed to go look further than its own military operation. It would have avoided most probably a chaotic situation like the one Libya has experienced for so many months now.